Okay, so this is titled The Japanese Economy After COVID-19. I'm not sure if we're in the period after COVID-19, probably not quite. So what we will be talking about is not so much of what's going on today, but what will be going on after, after we go through this pandemic. And so we will be talking about the likely future of the Japanese economy. And so this is an outline of this talk. But before I do that, let me do some advertisement. Adrian talked about, I will talk about the Japanese economy, or I will give an overview today, which I can't. But fortunately, I have just published a textbook on the Japanese economy with Taka Ito. This is a second edition of Taka's book on the Japanese economy, which published 30 years ago. And we have worked on revising that in the last almost decade to come up with a second edition. And as soon as we published the second edition, now the new things has been happening like a COVID-19. So we will need to revise this again. But second edition is available from MIT Press, and this talks about all the aspects of the Japanese economy. So if you haven't studied the Japanese economy before, and if you're interested in doing that after this talk, this is a very useful book to look at. I have another book, which will be published soon from Cambridge University Press, sometime next year, March next year, as they tell me. And this is co-edited with Philip Lipsey at the University of Toronto. And we talk about political economy, or this is an edited volume, which involves many authors to talk about the political economy of the Abe government and Abenomics reforms. So both political scientists and economists got together and talked about the experience of the Japanese political economy under the Abe government, which has just ended, which is a good news for our book, because now Abe administration is all complete, and we covered pretty much all the period that the Abe government covered. So coming back to this slide, I will be discussing, or I will be talking with you about the current situation and the near future of the Japanese economy under COVID-19. And as Adrian mentioned, the pandemic affected all the countries in the world, and including Japan and France and many other countries. So I will start by discussing the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on Japan, especially on the Japanese economy, very briefly. And then I will make a point which I think is important. That is that COVID-19 is a reallocation shock. So COVID-19 is a big macroeconomic shock. It's both a supply shock and a demand shock. But at the same time, I will argue, as some other people, some other economists, the COVID-19 is a reallocation shock as well, which has a very important implications. And I point out this is not the first time for the Japanese economy or any other economies to face massive shock, which requires reallocation or restructuring. And I will point out Japan's record to adjust to large reallocation shocks in the past isn't great. So Japan faced those similar shocks and didn't do quite well. And here I summarize what I mean by why Japan failed, or by saying Japan failed. And the point is, I will, of course, go over this more in detail in my talk, but the main problem is that Japan mostly relied on corporations to help their workers that affected by the economic shocks, instead of helping the workers directly at the individual levels. And so when the corporations are hit by a large economic shock, in order for the corporations to continue to help their workers, the government helps them, the corporations, so that they can stay in the business and protect employment. Okay, so this is protecting employment is a good thing. There's nothing wrong for the government try to do that, but the problem is the government, Japanese government, decided, or usually protect the corporations first in order to protect the workers they hire. And I point out this approach has serious problems, especially, or I point out the two of those problems. The one is, given the labor market practices or labor market characterization in the Japanese, characteristics in the Japanese economy, this approach to protect the corporations, to protect employment, concentrated the cost of adjustment to some limited number of groups. And I will elaborate this point later. And the second point is this approach created something called zombie firms, and which affected the Japanese economy or the performance of the economy. And I will again elaborate this point. And after going through those points, I will end by talking about how can Japan, or how should Japan try to avoid these problems. Okay. And as I said, or as Adrian said, you can ask the questions through chat anytime you want. Okay, and I don't see any questions so far, so I will move ahead. So the first one is the impacts of the COVID-19 on Japan. And I think there are two things, or two observations that I guess many of us make on this point. One is on health outcome. So if we compare the number of cases of COVID-19 or number of deaths in Japan to other major advanced countries, Japan looks quite good. You know, it's all relative. So these numbers are taken from the website listed here. Okay. So as of September 16, as of this week, these are the number of cases, deaths, and also a number of tests per million population for each country, including Japan and France here as well. And we know the situation in the US has been terrible, and the situation in many European countries have been serious as well. But compared with those countries, Japan, the impact, healthcare impact on Japan was, I think we can say, minor. Okay. Even though Japan has its share of cases and deaths, but compared with other countries, so far at least, Japan escaped the extremely serious health outcome. Okay. But in terms of economy, economy got hurt. And this shows a real GDP growth rate for the second quarter of 2020 this year for Japan, US, Euro area, and the UK. Again, the number for Japan is, or magnitude of the recession for Japan is a little bit smaller compared with the US and European countries. But still, this was an unprecedented recession in the post-war period. So these are the annualized growth rate for the second quarter of 2020. And as many of you know, in April and May, Japan was under the emergency situation. So that restricted many economic activities. So the Japanese economy shrunk by 28% at annual rate. And that is less serious than Euro area or UK, which experienced 60% decline in GDP, real GDP, but very close to the US situation, even though the healthcare situation in the US has been much worse than Japan. Okay. So even though the healthcare outcome of COVID-19 was relatively small compared with other countries, but the economy, the Japanese economy got hurt. Now, the second graph, or this graph that shows the economic condition for Japan is taken from business condition watcher survey done by the Japanese government, what used to be EPA, and now the Cabinet Office. And this shows this survey asks ordinary people in Japan, everywhere in Japan, or all over Japan, to judge where the economy is going, where the business is going, if it's improving or business condition is deteriorating. Okay, and they combine those answers and create this diffusion index, okay, which shows how the economy is, if the economy is improving or deteriorating. And if we look at this, okay, if we look at this picture, right after the pandemic started, okay, in early this year. So let me look at a bigger screen on my screen. Okay. So starting in around February or March, this business condition or indicator, the business condition watcher survey indicator declined heavily. Okay. So that shows the economic condition deteriorated. But starting in around May, June or so, okay, and the latest figure is in August, this figure shows as if the situation has recovered, okay? But it's not really the case because this is a so-called diffusion index. And what that means is a diffusion index, if there's a important meaning or special meaning for the value 50. The diffusion index takes 50 if all the people, or on average, if people believe the business condition is not changing. So when the diffusion index is above 50, that means more people are viewing the economy is improving. And if the diffusion index is below 50%, more people view that the economic situation is declining. Okay, so even though the diffusion index increased its value, it's still less than 50%. So what it means is the Japanese economy or the people view that the Japanese economy is still, business condition is still deteriorating. Okay, although not as seriously as it was deteriorating a couple of months ago. Okay. So the Japanese economy has been hit very hard by COVID-19. Now, we looked at the real GDP growth rate for the second quarter. It may be actually easier to see what happened by looking at the GDP in level. And this is a real GDP in level from I think you can see you can see these figures better than I do, from 1994 to 2020 or so. And we can see a huge decline of the level of output. So the huge decline of the level of output after the COVID-19 or the second quarter of 2020, which is pretty much comparable to what happened right after the global financial crisis. Okay, so the Japanese economic situation has been quite serious. So this shows by looking at the macroeconomic indicators, we can see the impact, the serious impact of the COVID-19 on Japanese economy. But I want to make a point today about the COVID-19 is not only a macroeconomic shock, but also a reallocation shock. So the impacts of the macroeconomic, the impacts of the COVID-19 has been different depending on which industry you look at, what kind of business we look at. Okay. So it hit some industries or businesses much harder than the other industries. And also at the other extreme, that created some new opportunities for new businesses. Okay, and this is something we can understand from our daily life. Okay, many things have changed after the COVID-19, and I think each one of us has a favorite example of what changed. But what we are doing now is one important change after the COVID-19. We do this lunch talk online. So lunch is not served, okay, which is a pity. But on the other hand, we don't have to move, we don't have to travel to the location of the talk. So that may be an advantage. And in general, in the remote working, I think there is, if at least the occasional remote working is probably a positive for productivity. So it may be a good thing. But we have been experiencing many changes after the pandemic. The remote working, online seminars, online education. At the University of Tokyo, we have moved everything online, and looks like we are starting some in-person class this fall quarter. But online education will stay even if this pandemic situation is over. And we, of course, use more often e-commerce and food delivery and things like that. Digital transformation. Many companies are now more serious about digital transformation. During the pandemic, there were some anecdotes like people in accounting have to come into the companies in order to put stamps or hanko. Now that may be changing. Okay. And there are other regulatory changes, important regulatory changes as well. The remote medicine has been approved at least temporarily and probably for a long time now, in the fast approval process for drugs and so on. And as I've been saying, we have experienced many changes, and the many changes I expect will stay. So people talk about new normal, and the point I want to make here is a new normal will be, well, new. So many things will be different. So that means the future will be different from the past in terms of the profitability of certain businesses and the type of goods or services that people demand. Okay, so that means the future will be different from the past. So we must expect major restructuring and reallocation of resources in the economy. So in that sense, COVID-19 is not only a macroeconomic shock, but a huge reallocation shock. And I'm not the only one to point this out, and I'm not even the first one to point this out. And there is an important paper done by Steve Davis, Nick Bloom, and Jose Maria Barrero on the exact title of COVID-19 is also a reallocation shock. This is an NBR working paper. And what they did is they looked at what the US corporations are forecasting. So they used the data from a survey of business uncertainty and calculated the difference or the extent of reallocation that the corporations are expecting, I think 3 months from the time of their survey. Okay. So they asked how much employment they expect to increase in 3 months or decrease in 3 months. And what they did was using that answer, they calculated something called excess reallocation. So excess reallocation is defined to be the gross expected jobs, expected number of jobs or job gains at firms that plan to increase the employment the next year, plus, oh, okay, so sorry, this was about next year, not the 3 months from now. Okay. And excess reallocation is defined to be the gross change in the jobs. So that means not only the job gains, but also the job losses, but you add those up, minus the absolute value of the net change obtained by summing over all the forecasts. Okay. So what this does is it calculates the extent of the job reallocation that is not necessary. For example, if there is the job gains of 200 million, sorry, 2 million, okay, and the job loss of 1 million, the net job gain is 1 million. Okay, so that in order to achieve that net gain of 1 million, all we need is a job gain of 1 million and job loss of 0. But in the reality, what's happening is that 2 million jobs are created and 1 million jobs are destroyed in order to have a net gain of 1 million jobs. So that means the 3 million jobs are either created or lost, but when you need to create just a 1 million job in net. Okay, so that 2 million jobs, the rest of 3 million jobs is in a sense kind of an excess of the reallocation. So that's the idea behind the excess reallocation. Probably a better way to explain what excess reallocation is, which I should have done a couple of minutes ago, is this is a job destruction or job loss backed by the new jobs, new job gains. Okay, so whichever interpretation you make, it's the same thing. The excess reallocation is a very good measure of the extent of reallocation. And what they find is that during the COVID-19 crisis, the net creation of jobs is expected to decline. Okay, so overall, the jobs are expected to be lost, but excess reallocation measure jumps up. So that means during following the pandemic, many corporations eliminate the jobs, but at the same time, many corporations create the jobs as well. And this is necessary because the COVID-19 was a reallocation shock, is a reallocation shock. That some firms have to decline and they need to, they have to reduce the employment. But in some other companies, the business continues to grow. Okay, some companies benefited from this change, and or there may be some other companies who newly enter the market in order to take advantage of the new opportunities. But there are enough number of those companies so that there are enough number of those companies who are actually gaining or they're adding to the jobs. And today we are using the Zoom meeting system. And as you all know, the Zoom is a company in California who benefited a lot from the change brought about by the pandemic. So they have been adding more people to their companies. So there have been a lot of the change in where the business opportunities are after the pandemic. And they do the same type of reallocation, excess reallocation measure for sales. And they also find overall the companies expect the reduced sales, but there are some companies who are increasing, who are expecting the increase of sales. At the same time, that some companies are expecting the reduction of the sales. And we can find a similar thing in Japan as well. And here, what I show is stock market index. Okay, so this is topics calculated by the Tokyo Stock Exchange. And this is an industry index. So they calculate the stock price index for each industry. And each of these stock prices are normalized to be 100 as of January 6th of 2020, at the beginning of this year. And what this figure shows is during the pandemic, okay, all of these stock prices started to fall. But for some industries, the decline was much larger than some other industries. And for some industries, actually, the stock prices recovered from the bottom. And now, actually, for some industries, these stock prices are well above 100, which means they recovered all these losses that happened during the pandemic. And what I want to point out is by looking at this figure, as the stock prices recovered, the difference between industries seems to have increased over time. Okay. So many people talk about, well, the stock price is kind of reflects the future of the economy. They are betting how much the companies will make in the future. So we can consider this as a future expectation that investors have in this economy about the future of the Japanese economy. And there are many talks about how the recovery from COVID-19 look like. People talk about V-shaped recovery, or maybe U-shaped recovery, or L-shape, which means non-recovery, or some people talk about Nike swash type of recovery. Okay. But it looks like what's happening for what is implied from the stock market is a K-shaped recovery. Okay. And this is actually taken from a slide Taka Ito, who's my co-author of the Japanese textbook, created, and I updated it. Okay. So, and what I did here was starting this graph of the 33 industry topics. I picked 3 industries where their stock price compared with the January stock price are the highest, and the 3 who are at the bottom of the stock price compared with January. Okay. And then it looks like all of these seems to have a shape K, okay, which means there are some industries which are expected to grow very fast, or actually seems to have recovered their stock price at the level of January of this year. And there are some other industries which continue to go down and not coming up. Well, some of them are coming up recently, but still at a very low level compared with at the level of January. Okay. So K-shaped recovery and the very diverse reaction to the pandemic seems to be clear from the stock market. Okay, so this is one evidence I can point out that COVID-19 seems to be also a reallocation shock also in Japan. And adjustment to a reallocation shock, the reallocation shock means some companies which were profitable before are not profitable anymore. and there are some new opportunities for new companies. So the reallocation shock requires economic restructuring. Okay. And for those of you who are not economists, economic restructuring is defined in this way. So I take this definition from Ricardo Caballero's book a while ago. So the economic restructuring means the process where old and inefficient production arrangements, corporations or the production units, are destroyed and replaced by new and efficient production arrangement. Okay, so some jobs will be lost, some jobs will be created, some new jobs will be created. And this is also called creative destruction. So economic restructuring, so the reallocation shock, what the reallocation shock requires the economy to do is to go through economic restructuring. So some companies become unprofitable and they will need to leave the market or close the business. And they're replaced by the new companies in new businesses. Okay, so now I noticed there are some questions. So let me get to that after I have finished going through this slide. Okay. So the economic restructuring, because in the economic restructuring, old and inefficient companies are destroyed, or the jobs are destroyed and replaced by a new and efficient production arrangement that involves entry of new firms and exit of fading firms. And it also involves reallocation of workers. The workers need to move from fading companies to new firms or growing firms. And I will mention now, looking at Japan, Japan hasn't done very well in economic restructuring in the last 20 to 30 years. Okay, so here's a question from Nadej. It would be interesting to see the graphic applied to food products industry or gastronomy, as it is one of the sectors that has suffered a lot. Okay, so we know the restaurants and hotels, those are hurt very much by this COVID-19. And I'm looking at this legend of this graph, which is in Japanese, if that includes any such industry. And it's not clear. It may be included in service industry, okay, which, so I'm not sure where that belongs to. Probably service industry. And service industry is one of, well, it's not included in the bottom three, but I remember if you take the bottom 5 or 6, the service industry is included. So they have not been doing very well. Okay, and I would like to come back to the service industry, or especially the restaurants later, because I will be talking about the failure of business, okay, business failures. And that's one of the areas where we see a lot of that the food industry or the restaurants are the industry where we have seen many failures this year following the COVID-19. Okay, so I will come back to the issue of the restaurants then as well. Okay. Any other questions? So if you have any questions, you can add to the chat. Okay. So I hope this is working. Okay. So I just talked about the economic restructuring. So and even in the restaurants area. Okay. So most of there have been many failures, and there will be more failures now. So in net, we will probably, I expect we will have less number of restaurants in Tokyo following this COVID-19. But at the same time, we observe the new restaurants have been starting up. Okay, I'm not sure how well they are doing, but so of course those are new restaurants coming up or entering the market after COVID-19 is more conscious about the infection and so on. So they could try to create a more safe environment compared with what the old restaurants used to do. So they may have some competitive advantage. But the point is, at the same time that many restaurants are exiting the industry, we also observe the new entry as well. So there's an economic restructuring even inside the restaurant industry. So I will, let me continue talking about the economic restructuring. And so the reallocation shock requires economic restructuring. So in order to get out of this COVID-19 recession and resume the economic growth, Japan needs to adjust to this reallocation shock well. But Japan has not done that very well. Okay, let me, I thought this graph shows the failure of the adjustment in the past large shocks, but it's not clear but just by looking at it. So let me skip this. Okay. Or maybe I shouldn't. Okay. Maybe I shouldn't. Okay, because okay. So the Japan, so what I mean here is each time in the past when Japan faced a big macroeconomic shock and reallocation shock, okay, the Japanese economy's growth rate seems to have fallen. Okay, so this graph shows the level of GDP. So this is exactly the same graph as we saw before. From 1994 to 2020. And this is a kind of trend from late 1990 or early 2000 to 2007. So then the global financial crisis hit Japan, and Japan recovered from the global financial crisis, but the trend growth rate, trend growth past the level of the GDP seems to have lost forever, and even the growth rate seems to have reduced again. Okay, so the Japan never went back to the past trend. Okay, and so the big question is if the same thing happens Japan, the same thing happens to Japan after the COVID-19, or if it can go back to the old trend. So this is a very rough picture, but if you, we could divide the period even finer, and we can see how the Japanese economy could, or how the growth rate of Japan forecasted in 1990s was lowered again in 2000. So we can do this type of comparison for more shorter period. But the point is that Japan, each time the Japan faced a large economic shocks, large reallocation shock, Japan failed to go back to the original trend. Okay. And so in that sense, the Japan didn't quite adjust to those large shocks very well. So here's another question. How does a new and efficient production arrangement take into account your impact on environment? Okay, that's a good question, and I think that's well, I think that's all I need to, or all I can say. It depends on the so Maximilian, so you're talking about the restaurant industry or in general? Can you turn your mic on? Or in general, okay. The new and efficient production arrangement, which will be here if and will stay if they are profitable. Okay. So I'm sure that depends on which industry or which services or which goods we talk about. Okay. And some of those production arrangement may be better or better in terms of environment. Some of those new arrangement may be worse in terms of environment, but that depends on the business condition, the economic conditions, and also that depends on the regulation and the taxation as well, which influences the whether the company needs to pay the cost for environment or not. Okay, so we can come back to this question later. Okay, so let me move on. So why Japan didn't do very well in the past when faced by a large economic shocks, and my claim is the way that Japan tried to adjust to those changes. And this is something we learn, or this is something many people know about the Japanese labor market. But the Japanese labor market is characterized by lifetime employment system. So the companies do not fire the workers, and the workers do not quit the companies and work for the same company until the mandatory retirement at age, used to be 55, now somewhere between 60 and 65. And because the corporations under the lifetime employment system cannot adjust the labor force when they are hit by the economic shock, the company, the Japanese government, when there is a huge shock, often try to protect the corporations so that the corporations can continue to employ their workers. Okay. So that's a major characteristic of Japanese policy, Japanese economic policy, to confront the reallocation shock or to confront the big economic shock. Okay. Or in other words, Japan tried to actually resist the changes, so resist the necessary economic restructuring by helping the corporations to resist those changes. So that's what I think, or what I claim, was the most important failure of the economic policy in Japan to adjust to the economic shocks. And what is the problem of this type of policy? And let me come back to that example. Okay. So the problems of protecting corporations to protect employment, I want to point out two of those. And one is, this is the type of policy to protect the corporation so that they protect the workers would be okay if all the workers are protected. But it's not the case in the lifetime employment system that all the workers are protected. The lifetime employment system is pretty much limited to the regular employees. An overall majority of the regular employees are men, okay, the male regular employees in large firms. Okay. So those lucky employees, their jobs are safe, but there are lots of people who are outside this protection of the lifetime employment system, and they tend to suffer during from the economic shock because their jobs are not protected by the companies. Okay? So the government approach to protect the companies, to protect the employment, doesn't work for the workers who are outside the traditional lifetime employment system. And the second problem is by protecting the companies, including those companies who would who are unprofitable, and the economy would benefit from the exits of those companies. By protecting even those firms, the policy can create a problem by creating what are called zombie firms. And zombie firms may not be happening, not yet, okay? But the first problem of that some workers who are outside the lifetime employment system tend to suffer if the government just try to protect the corporations, seems to be already happening. Okay. So I'm looking at the time now. So I should finish in about 60 minutes, or Adrian, can you remind me? Or
yeah, you have still 10 minutes.
Okay.
Or a little bit more, it's okay. And then we keep time for question and answer.
Okay. So let me just elaborate these points, and if I want to come back, if you want to come back to all your pictures I skipped, I can do that. But let me move on. So the first point is that only a limited group of workers are protected, and there are many workers outside the lifetime employment system who suffers during the large economic shock is already observable in the COVID-19 pandemic. And in a sense, the COVID-19 shock was even worse than many of the shocks that we experienced in the past, because the COVID-19 shock itself tend to harm those workers who are outside the lifetime employment system more than so in the lifetime employment system. Okay. So there's a very nice paper by a colleague of mine at the University of Tokyo, Sagiri Kitao, and her co-authors. Okay. And they look at the distribution of the workers in different type of jobs and the different type of industries, and how much those people, how much each group is likely to be affected by the COVID-19. Okay. So what they find is COVID-19 shock has larger impacts on non-flexible jobs, so the jobs that are difficult to make remote, and a social type of jobs that requires the face-to-face interactions and or regular commute, those type of industries. So non-flexible jobs and the social industries are where the cost of COVID-19 is concentrated. And they calculated how the Japanese workers are distributed among flexible or non-flexible or ordinary and social industries. And what they find is the many regular workers in flexible and ordinary industry where the impact of COVID-19 is small, ordinary or flexible, and only a small portion of regular workers, 17.2%, are in the social industry and non-flex jobs. So this is where the COVID-19 shock is felt most. But for the non-regular workers, 43.9%, 44%, or almost close to half are in social industry and non-flexible jobs. So the non-regular workers are already outside the lifetime employment system. And this time the COVID-19 shock hit the jobs that they held more than the jobs that regular workers held. So in those sense, they are doubly harmed in this COVID-19. Okay, and they also have, okay, I somehow didn't include the other slide about their papers, but they also consider how the job distributions are different between men and women, and also between college graduates and non-college graduates. And they found that the non-college graduates tend to have more social and non-flexible jobs. And also female workers tend to be in social industry and have non-flexible jobs. So those workers who are outside the lifetime employment system tend to be hurt more. And this is the actual job losses that we can calculate or we can measure from January to July, or what happened so far in this year. And for each categories of those workers, this shows the percentage increase or percentage change in the number of employment for all workers and male workers only and female workers. So we can see something like, if you look at the non-farm employment, overall employment declined, but the employment declined more for female workers. And this third line shows the numbers in 10,000. So for the male, from January this year to July this year, 320,000 jobs were destroyed. But for women, 450,000. Okay, 50% more jobs were destroyed. So the cost was concentrated more on the women. There's a stark difference between regular employment or seiki shain and the non-regular employment. Okay, the regular employment, they didn't change very much from January to July, but the non-regular employment got reduced. So those jobs are destroyed. And especially the dispatched workers or haken workers, which are included in non-regular employment, they got hurt. Their jobs are lost. And in terms of the size of the companies, if you look at the large companies who still have a more lifetime employment system, especially their male employees, they haven't lost. Their jobs haven't lost. But small companies and even the medium companies, their job reduction was much larger. So it shows not only the COVID-19, the characteristics of the COVID-19 shock, but also it's a reflection of the Japanese employment system and the Japanese government policy to first protect corporations in order to protect employment. Okay, some employments are protected, but the cost of adjustment is concentrated on or concentrates on some groups who are outside the lifetime employment system. And finally, the second problem of the protecting the companies instead of the protecting the individual workers is the policy may end up helping the zombie companies. So zombie firm is a concept that several people, including myself, developed in 2000, motivated by the experience of Japan in the late 1990s. Okay. And the zombie firm is defined to be a firm that is unprofitable and would cease to exist without help from creditors and or the government. And for the 1990s, the many Japanese banks were undercapitalized, and they wanted to hide the non-performing loans. So they try to hide the non-performing loans by extending or continue to extending loans to non-performing companies. So that was initial motivation for the research and the concept of the zombie problems. And zombie had, and we and economists, including ourselves, we found zombie firms zombie firms discourage the growth of productive firms in Japan and hurts the economic growth. But recently, many papers have been written about the zombie problems in Europe, and they have been finding similar problems. Okay? And here I list only 2 papers, but there seems to be a growing number of papers which talk about the problem with the zombie firms in discouraging growth of productive firms. So the policies to protect, so this is another problem of the policies to protect corporations instead of individual workers. And during the COVID-19, the government did some policy, implemented some policies to protect the corporations, old policies to protect the corporations again, through giving subsidies for the corporations to continue their business, and providing loans through government financial institutions and also private banks with 0 interest rate, no collateral, no guarantee. So the government has been trying to protect the companies. Although there have been some direct assistance to individuals that were tried in Japan, which seems to be relatively new. Okay. And all of these responses happened during the pandemic, and there is probably a benefit of avoiding too many bankruptcies during the pandemic or during the crisis. But protecting too many firms, or especially the giving loans to those companies so that they can survive, can actually impede the adjustment to the new normal, the adjustment or the economic restructuring. Okay. And let me show you some pictures that may show that we may be observing some problems in the lack of economic restructuring. Okay. So this is a number of bankruptcy cases. The sources are Tokyo Shoko Research. And many of us are here, many of you hear the news like the COVID-19 has been hurting the many companies, and the many companies are going out of business. So this is a number of bankruptcies recorded by the Tokyo Shoko Research going back to January of 19. Oh, I could go back even more, but this shows the number of bankruptcies for each month from January of 1919 to August of 2020. Okay. So the one thing we immediately see in this figure is actually one thing we immediately do not see in this picture, which we expect to see in this picture, is an increase in bankruptcy or jump in bankruptcies because of the COVID-19, which hasn't happened. Okay, so the number of bankruptcies has not increased. And if we actually go back to 2017, 2016, the number of bankruptcies were higher than these. Much higher than the 700 per month or so. Okay. And we even see the decline of bankruptcies in May of 2020 during the pandemic. So this may show that the government policy to avoid the bankruptcies during the state of emergency helped, or maybe it helped too much, and actually reduce the bankruptcy, which would happen normally during this period. And when we talk about bankruptcy, we tend to think bankruptcy is bad, or many people tend to see the bankruptcy is bad, but especially bad for the corporations or the owners of the corporations. But it's not really so. The bankruptcy, if we think about it, is a mechanism to protect the borrowers from the lenders. And the borrowers can stop paying to the lenders while they sort out how much assets they have and how the losses should be allocated between creditors and other stakeholders. So the bankruptcy is we talk about the bankruptcy protection. Okay, so the bankruptcy is a way to protect the owners of the firms so that they can sort out the situation and restructure the business and revive the profitability. So the lack of bankruptcies, okay, or the lack of the increase in bankruptcies when the economic restructuring is necessary can be something we should worry about. And let me show one more graph, and let me finish for now. Okay. And this is the amount of bank loans, okay, to the corporations. And we can see under the COVID-19 crisis, the amount of bank loans in Japan increased by 30 trillion yen in the last half a year or so, in the last 3 or 4 months. So this shows, on the one hand, the government policy to encourage the Japanese banks, including government financial institutions, to help the borrowers who are effective. But at the same time, these are the loans, not the gifts. Okay, so the corporations have to pay back those loans in the end. So this can create actually excessive debt or too much debt, and create what the economist calls a debt overhang problem. Okay, so debt overhang is when the corporations have too much debt. When they try to invest in new business, and if the new business, the profitability is modest, they may not want to invest in that business because the modest profit you can get from those new business are all used to pay back the loans. So in order to encourage the corporations to restructure their business and increase the profitability, you probably want to restructure you probably want to reduce the debt and to the right size of the corporation, and then to encourage the corporations to invest in new business. So the excessive debt can actually impede the process of economic restructuring, which will be necessary to adjust to the new normal. So let me summarize. Okay, so these are what I try to convince or try to argue today. Japan seems to have gone through the pandemic with a lot less health harm than many other countries, but the damage for the economy was large. The COVID-19 is not only a macroeconomic shock, but also a reallocation shock. And Japan has not been doing a great job adjusting to a large economic shock. And one of the most important policy failure was to rely too much on asking corporations to help their workers and not directly to help the individual workers. And just by protecting the workers, just by protecting the corporations, the past policies, past adjustment policies of the Japanese government concentrated the cost of adjustment to a disadvantaged group, and also created the zombie firms that hurts economic growth.